He has been with us from almost the very beginning, but since he arrived and started working with us on the Water Partners of Tacoma, has been instrumental in helping us shape how we've thought about growing this cluster. He introduced us to Ben Grumbles, by the way, and suggested he might be an excellent addition to this event, and we thought so highly of that recommendation, we made him the keynote. So we appreciate that very much. So, Steve, I'm going to hand it to you. Do you want the mobile mic? Okay, I'm going to hand it to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Bruce. Well, thank you. And we are going to talk about where we go next, but part of it we also want to talk about where do we see the water industry going next. And we've heard a lot about where the stormwater activities happening, but I'm going to bring up a few issues. We're going to discuss it briefly with the panel, and then we're going to actually have a broader discussion with everyone in the audience, because there's a lot of expertise out here as well. So first, let me just briefly mention some of the things that are coming up in the water world that are emerging areas for continual development and new technology. And Ben had mentioned one of these earlier, and that's the whole smart technology, the whole, using the cloud and big data to start managing our systems, not only our big centralized systems, but distributed systems, so they get really smart. So they can be reactive to the storm cloud as it comes in. We can start having our systems reacting on the, using the intelligence of the internet and expert systems to start doing that. So that's a whole new area that's emerging, where there'll be broad sensors that'll be managing our systems that will link electricity, water, energy, and then also they can even be tied into the natural systems. So like, are your street trees getting enough water? How are you doing in various parts of or park system, for example, health systems? So this kind of integration of data and infrastructure is a whole new emerging area that we're seeing a lot about. Another one that comes up is the whole microbial community. This came up, I think John Stark had mentioned, that when you start looking down at the tiniest scale, the microorganisms that live in, that help treat our wastewater system, that are in the soils, that are actually in our guts, the amount of information we have about that scientifically right now is surprisingly little. I was just within the last year where a report came out that they found 2,000 species living in our gut that they'd never even identified before. Now this sounds kind of gross, but this is how we digest food, right? There's micro communities that interact with each other, and the way they communicate with each other, the way that they react to stimuli is extremely important, and that it can have a big impact on the way water quality treatment works and on how our own health works, and as well as others. So this whole understanding, mapping of the DNA of the species of the microbial community, and understanding how they work, and then taking advantage of that to create smarter natural systems to treat, that's a whole nother emerging area. And there's a lot of interesting research going on, particularly in Europe and a little bit in Asia, and some, of course, in the US and Singapore. Anyway, that's another emerging field. A third one is that Damon Diesner had mentioned too, is this integration between stormwater and wastewater and drinking water. Now, no one wants wastewater and drinking water to get integrated, right? Yet, if we can, as we learned, if we can pull stormwater out of sewer systems, then they don't overflow. That helps our water quality. If we pull that stormwater out, it's clean enough it can be used to flush our toilets. So then that reduces our drinking water supply. So starting to think across those media, across the different silos of water, is another area where we're going to get smarter and smarter. And I think Bennett and others had mentioned this as well. Energy is another part of that integration that's emerging now as kind of where a lot of thought leaders are going, because there is three or four kinds of energy in water. There's the nutrients that are in wastewater that can be used to be, create natural gas that could then be burned. There's the thermal energy that when everyone takes a shower or does the dishes or does the laundry, that hot water goes down the drain. When that drain goes by, there's billions of BTUs of energy that go down the drain every day, and that's now a waste product that goes out basically in Puget Sound in our case. There's going to be a little story tonight on King 5 News about the potential to use that thermal energy and reuse it to reduce heating and cooling costs. So if you, for example, a campus like the University of Washington Tacoma, if they have a system where the buildings are linked together, they could harvest wastewater going by, harvest the thermal energy out of that. So that's another emerging area, which ties into another emerging area, which is the use of private capital to augment public services. And this is something that, again, we'd heard earlier from Ben. And how do we make sure that we protect the public right and access to water and ownership, yet take advantage of private capital and business expertise to manage these systems in a way that provides a good return on investment and or addresses some of these other issues that we've been worried about. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that there's a kind of a growing overlap as well between sustainability and resilience. And sustainability is about, making sure that next generations have the same opportunity as this generation. And resilience is about bouncing back from things that happen to you. And when we start looking at cities that live for hundreds of years, they are going to, like Tacoma, it's 170 years old or something like that. This city is going to be around for hundreds of years, and there's things that are going to happen to it, some of which the city can plan for and some of which you can't plan for, but you can plan to be more resilient to different kinds of things that happen. And that particularly comes up if you start thinking about climate change. What does that mean? Is our weather going to stay the same? Is it going to be different? Is it going to do both? And so what does all that mean? So that's another area where there's emerging thinking going on. How do we weave thinking about resilience to uncertainty into the way that we design and manage our systems? And so let me ask Ben first. Climate change is something that briefly was touched on today, but we haven't heard much about. What's your sense, Ben, of what role, if any, climate change might play in some of the stormwater strategies that we've heard about so far?
Well, I'll just say that one of my last acts when I was heading up the EPA water program, the National Water Program, was to issue a water and climate strategy, which was a series of 44 actions that the National Water Program, with partners at the state and local and private sector, could really focus on to embrace water adaptation, recognizing that mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions can be advanced in the water programs through water efficiency and the energy-water nexus. But the real game for the future, the most pressing and urgent matter for water managers around the country, is how do you adapt various programs, infrastructure programs as well as regulatory programs. And stormwater is obviously one of the most important in that area. There are legal questions that are playing out to this day right now as to whether or not the whole total maximum daily load program under the Clean Water Act, the pollution budgets, which are supposed to have a margin of safety to take into account loadings over a period of time. How is that adequate margin of safety interpreted in a climate of greater uncertainty and extreme weather? After a while, shouldn't regions begin to plan and know even more so if precipitation is going to significantly increase in some areas? So one big question on the regulatory front with stormwater is to what extent should standards change over time, and how about pollution budgets under the TMDL program? Another great example, though, of how the stormwater program, as people of good intentions struggle with it to make it as successful as possible over the years, is how does the stormwater program reconcile this need under the Clean Water Act, which is a strict liability statute? It doesn't matter how good faith your efforts are if, at the end of the day, the regulator or a citizen group that is using its authorities under Section 505 of the Clean Water Act, if they can demonstrate that you're not meeting your requirements under the Clean Water Act, you are in violation of that act. how do you reconcile a strict liability statute with increasing uncertainty with stormwater and extreme weather events? You know, it's a legal question, but even more than that, I think there's a real policy question. How do you improve the monitoring? Maybe the last thing I'll say on this topic of climate adaptation and stormwater is, as the country rightfully and understandably invests much, much more money in the science and monitoring of climate change from a waterfront perspective, the question is how do you downscale that information so that the water resource manager at the local level or at the watershed level can really plan accordingly and modify the stormwater program or the wetlands permitting program when decisions are, you know, deciding whether or not a new development project is going to be allowed. If you know in a coastal area that the sea level is rising and soil subsidence, you're going to be losing wetlands in a certain area, how do you respond to that? And that's not just a stormwater question, that's a wetlands permitting, wetlands regulatory question. But there are a whole lot of important decisions ahead and opportunities for policymakers in the context of increasing precipitation, more extreme events in the Clean Water Act world and in the stormwater permitting world.
So if there is climate change happening, then the standards that we've used, which were based upon the way the weather used to be, that's how the standards were set. Like you can have no more than one overflow per year, for example, with combined sewer overflows. Or nutrient loading, where it's based upon an understanding of what the basic flow is going through the system. But if the weather is radically different, if it's drier, then maybe your pollutant loading goes above. And so then our standards are based upon the world being relatively stable, or at least the weather being stable. And if it is less stable than we know, or than we can model because of the downscaling, which is the issue of they have these global models about how the weather might work, but saying what will happen in Tacoma versus Vancouver is almost impossible with those big models like that. So it's like a lot of folks are, if these models really are representative of our future, we still are flying blind underneath them, and that's what downscaling is about, trying to get it specific.
Getting more of the data that is out there but is global and over a large area, how do you translate that into usable information that, in the spirit of best professional judgment, permit writers and those who are deciding land use and planning can take advantage of that and you know, move forward properly and legally and scientifically in a defensible way.
So Art, how about in the building industry? Is climate change something people think about, worry about, ignore, or all the above?
Well, I'm sure it's all of the above. You know, the climate has always been changing and always will change, and depending on how those get implemented are going to affect not only water but construction and transportation and all facets of life. That's something that's sort of a to be determined.
How about anyone out there? What's your sense of, in the South Puget Sound area, how are people thinking about climate change? Or are they seeing that as an issue, or are there more immediate issues that are really driving the discussion? Anyone have a thought on that? Well, let me ask John. John Stark, you talked about the water quality, low impact development, and the health of salmon. And so does climate change the research that you're doing?
Yeah. Of course it does. It really does change things. And the reason is this: salmon need really cold water in the freshwater system to be viable, to survive and grow and all that. And so as temperatures increase, it can be an inhospitable climate for them. The other thing is, and we know this from our own work and a lot of other scientific studies, that when you add stressors to organisms, like, say, for example, an increase in temperature, they become more susceptible to other stressors. So that changes the whole dynamic. So in other words, we may think that some chemical has a certain toxicity, for example, or an effect, and then if you increase the temperature by a couple of degrees, that effect can be greatly magnified, for example. All right? So all of these things are really important, but I want to go back to your question. I was going to comment on that. When you said in the South Sound, you know, what are people doing or thinking about climate change? I mean, who do you mean, this audience, or do you mean the average citizen? Because if you mean the average citizen, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and what I find is, outside of my sphere of people, you know, like the academics and government people and all that, most people don't even care. Because basically they're trying to survive, they're living their day-to-day life, and it's not on their radar screen. And so if you talk to people in academia, they believe that everybody's really concerned about this, but that's not true. I really don't believe it is. And I mean, you can look at surveys and polls, but again, go ask your average person and ask them, how important is climate change to you? And they're going to say, it isn't. That's my take on it, at least.
And to amplify on that, I'm going to ask Susan Seuss, who's our lead recruiter at the Economic Development Board, who talks to companies all the time that are making investment decisions for the first time in Pierce County, whether this is the none of the above, as Art said, and it's sort of as what John is saying, or if she's hearing something different.
All the above.
All of the above. Sorry, none of the above, all of the above.
In business recruitment, I'm working with companies themselves, consultants and site selectors that are helping companies try to figure out where they might expand or locate their next facility. And I have never heard one of them say anything about climate change. What I have heard is a real concern over confusing and conflicting regulations at the local, state, and federal level. That's making it really hard for companies coming in to even know what questions to ask. They might know what's required in an area where they've developed before, but they don't even know what the landscape looks like here. They don't know what they don't know. So working toward consistency in regulations and removing some of the conflict from the local level and the federal level, I think that's an area where there's a great opportunity as far as helping to grow the economy. But I've not heard anything about climate change.
There's Connie and then the woman in orange. Yep.
Okay, I'm closer to you.
I just want to comment. You asked about what other people are hearing, and I recently heard a talk by Climate Solutions in Seattle, and they put out an interesting publication called Natural Infrastructure. Some of you may have seen, and I thought it was interesting because that's a term. Seattle Public Utilities used to use the term natural drainage for basically what we now call green infrastructure. So they were resurrecting this idea of natural infrastructure and pretty much touting all the different kind of collaborative benefits of more greenery and in the cities. So in essence, it doesn't have to be a separate kind of here's what we do for climate change, but really a lot of the things that we're talking about with low impact development also have these other benefits that affect climate change.
So the issue that maybe some strategies, whether or not climate change is a driver, might make us better situated to handle it if it does become an issue.
Yeah, speaking as a layperson, we get so many conflicting pieces of information, whether climate change is real and what real might be. Is it more? Is it less? To what extent? So the public, I think, in terms of what John was saying, aren't listening. And the second point about the layperson is that we tend to act when there's a crisis. And when you don't see the water underneath your windowsill, there's no crisis. And there are so many other crisis that people face every day that they're not thinking of something like that. And so if they are impeded by regulations relative to what somebody supposes is going to be climate change, it's aggravating, and it is a really very dampening to economic development. So I just think that maybe get together, whoever is saying, and make sure what you're saying is the truth and put a timeline on it so that there is a crisis point, a tipping point.
Tell the truth.
Well, I think there's a couple of things we need to look at, and that's where we live. and look at geography. You're right, it's not on a lot of people's radar that live here in the Pacific Northwest, because probably one of the, from a natural disaster perspective, flooding is probably our biggest concern around here. But when we do, we're not living with tornadoes and hurricanes and things like that. So it is different for us here. So, I think it depends a lot where you live. But as far as how does it affect our plans for the future and for economic development and growth, I look at it as a recruiting tool, to be honest with you, to say that, we have different geography here, we have different climate patterns here, but we've addressed those in different ways. We're building infrastructure to support where we live and our climate that we have here. So I look at it as a way to celebrate it. And like you said, Connie, it's very true. If we're going to put information out there, it needs to be science-based and it needs to be factual, and give people then the tools that they need to make informed decisions.
A couple of efforts that I know about where climate change has been part of the discussion is one at DOT, they did an infrastructure risk assessment based on climate change scenarios. So that's one. The other one I'm aware of is in the city of Olympia in two aspects. Their location decision of their new city hall was influenced by climate change in terms of sea level rise. And so the new city hall got built on much higher ground. There is also discussion at the city about the need for a seawall with rising waters, because the downtown would be inundated. And their projection is in the, 10s or 20s of years, not decades on out. So those are a couple examples. And on the other subject, as far as recruiting, one of the interesting presentations I saw a number of years from a gentleman from Eco Northwest, which was a consultant in Eugene, Oregon, showed the social migration impacts of climate change in the United States. And guess who was targeted for a net mega receiver of new flood of population? The Pacific Northwest, from folks fleeing in the desert Southwest. And so in addition to the challenges of dealing with climate change, I think a challenge about a pretty significant inflow of new citizens to our area is going to be at hand also.
Now, I don't have any scientific data to back me up, but it seems like the stormwater locally for the last 3 to 4 years have increased in intensity by magnitudes. It used to be that you just get misted to death on an everyday basis. Now we're getting downpours to the point where people are actually buying umbrellas. And it's not really helping, because it's still basically giving you more downpours. So I think even from a microcosm of the Northwest, we're seeing tremendous effects with climate change just because of the amount of rainfall we're getting on an immediate now basis. And then on situations of business climate, I know from one of the fact that one of my competitors, I manufacture textiles on a second company, but one of my competitors was based in Mobile, Alabama, when Hurricane Katrina came in. And within 6 months, they moved out and moved to Pennsylvania for a cost of about $3 million, just because they didn't want to deal with the climate anymore. So there's a big plus living here in the Pacific Northwest, just because we have a real climate-friendly potential for business. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ryan Petty with the Economic Development Board. I want to thank this panel and really all the other panels today. The speakers have just been incredible, and I'm in awe at the creativity that's been evident on the stage today. That being said, as an economic developer, I'm really concerned because what I see in the uncertainty of the situation we face with regard to stormwater regulation, and stormwater technology is an almost infinite potential to ratchet regulations and requirements tighter, and almost no indication that they might relax or even stay the same. So when I look at what it takes to do a real estate transaction, and there are many different kinds of real estate transactions and many different situations, but there's often a go, no-go point in consideration of the feasibility of doing a deal on real estate development. And this is that next increment of cost. And I'm particularly concerned that we're considered a phase one community in a regional contest for growth and development, in which similarly situated cities are considered phase two cities and are subject to lesser requirements. That kind of thing can be the difference between a deal penciling out and a deal not penciling out. So we need a kind of certainty, and we need a kind of level playing field, and neither of which do I see adequately, though I can tell you from the Economic Development Board's perspective, we intend to do deals anyway. But still, I see an emerging and growing challenge. Now, from the Washington Building Industry Association, our panelist has quite a bit of experience and has done a lot of transactions in Kitsap County, as he indicated earlier. So I'd like to ask you perhaps to comment on my comments about uncertainty, in the hopes that we can define a path to go forward that gives us a little ray of hope, so that we can continue to grow and develop the economy and diversify it here in Tacoma-Pierce County.
Thank you. I concur with all the comments you made, and I'm not sure I'm going to be optimistic in what I'm going to tell you, is that Washington State, because a guy by the name of Boeing was living here and decided to get in the airplane business, created tens of thousands of jobs and a huge wealth in our region. And due to genetics and a little bit of luck, we have a Microsoft based here and some other technology companies rather than elsewhere. It's sort of circumstance created a lot of the affluence that's come in Washington. And as we move forward, here's some regulatory or potential regulatory items that are up for debate. I don't know what's going to happen with them. I'm not editorializing about them, but think how these things may affect both current and future industrial and manufacturing clients. There's a lawsuit and a process with the Department of Ecology dealing with fish consumption and how tight should the water quality standards be regarding that. The governor is looking for some sort of climate change or carbon tax or some climate change procedure that will be in this state and not in other states. And you're also seeing with new stormwater regulations and other regulatory also that sometimes conflict with individual state regulations conflicting, and also some conflicting with the federal government. And I'm not saying that these are bad. I'm just saying that these are things that people who want to locate business or grow businesses are going to be evaluating as they move forward. We're also seeing watershed incrementally around the state being shut down for additional use of potable water. There are several counties and number of watersheds that are in moratorium, and I think you're going to see increasing that. If we look at the future, I think we're going to see, if we're looking at, especially I'll move towards the stormwater aspect, is that you've got a lot of entrepreneurs back here who are looking at the science and looking at proprietary devices that may become very effective in dealing with specific stormwater pollutants for helping remove those. You're going to see a regulatory environment. The EPA is near putting out a low-impact development mandate nationally. You're going to see the science continue to grow with this work that's being done at WSU and elsewhere of how do these devices and these systems and these techniques work? How well do they work? And that's going to affect the regulatory benefit that gets enabled. And so one of the things we're looking at is how do all these things mesh in the future? And each of you and all of us are going to be part of that decision-making process in some direct or indirect way, and we just need to make it so that our region continues to prosper and continues to have the environmental quality that we all treasure.
I think that's a great point, and one of the things that we heard in the presentation just before this one was about doing the EIS for the whole sub-area and basically trying to align the conflicting regulations and incentives so that it facilitates the outcome that the city wants. And we've certainly heard all day today lots of leading edge thinking going on and research around how stormwater can be managed. And so if it sounds too like there's a lot of interest in the audience around harmonization between the various regulatory regimes so that we can kind of have this clean water technology vision, and what does it take to align the regulations so that they're supportive of the vision and they also support the outcomes that we want, which is more jobs and more development in Tacoma. So would the idea at least for consideration by the committee as they're getting ready for next year, is there some interest in the crowd at least around talking about that more, around the alignment between regulatory entities and how to facilitate in kind of the regulatory realm achieving sort of the clean water technology outcomes that we want in South Sound? Is that something that there's interest in, if that was a topic for next year? All the economic development people, put your hands down because I knew you already were there. But no, that's great. What about other topics? Are there other things that were raised today that you would like to learn more about next year, or that any of the panelists thinks might be interested to? Did I see a hand way in the back there? Blue?
And then we'll go back there.
Okay, Lane.
Actually, being in private sector, I think Ben brought it up, and it really intrigued me in terms of how do we change the paradigm on the economy, the economics of water. When I look at development, I do a lot with different developers, and it comes down to lease rates. And you see, lease rates just 30 miles up in Seattle, twice what you could ever get for comparable property here in Tacoma. And so I think a topic on, the public-private partnerships, or how do you change the economics of it, would be very important. I think really, Dr. Baker said it best, arithmetic works. And it's going to be an economic issue at some point in time.
Right. So one good idea would be to get Amazon to move to Tacoma, because they're certainly driving Seattle's rents with tens of thousands of new employees right in downtown Seattle.
So Susan will tell you that Amazon's opening a 1 million square foot distribution fulfillment facility in DuPont. It will be open in the first quarter of next year that she recruited here. So we got a little piece of Amazon, which we would like to think is a big piece. Go ahead.
Okay, it's me again. I'm still trying to figure out how to make money on this. And sitting around and talking about how we solve our problems for us doesn't make very many of us any money. And it doesn't make Susan happy. So maybe a topic that might work next year is it possible for us to market, and it's probably the political folks among us who have to do this, to market our TAPE program, to market our expensive and exhaustive and very analytical approach to clean water technology to other states or other countries? We had our guest from China answer a question that sort of indirectly got me started on this. Is who's helping you with this? And she said, well, Canada's selling us some stuff. And they're next door. So why aren't we selling them stuff too? And maybe we could be, through TAPE or some other program, the UL listing of clean water technology. We certainly spend enough money proving it, and maybe we ought to be able to market it a little bit better.
Comment. Any other folks on that wavelength? And in a sense, I really think that's what the Wellspring event is about. It's about understanding the resources that are available and identifying the opportunities that are out there, and then building the capacity of the South Sound region to sell and market those unique leadership opportunities that we have around clean water technology and other things. But I think that is an interesting topic, is how do we build the industry locally, and then how do we market it beyond and create the jobs. And then also Lane's point about techniques to drive up the rents, which then creates more cash flow, which makes lots of other things easier as well. Any other folks? What about the role of private capital in public infrastructure? I remember about 10 or 15 years ago there was a big push on that front. It kind of faded away. One of the issues that comes up for the big international companies that have all this tons of capital is the fractured way that the water industry is just fractured. However, big companies like Veolia was mentioned earlier, they're reorganizing themselves in North America to be a service provider for local entities. Is that something that's interesting, or is that threatening, or both?
Steve, on that, can you describe how that might work or is working somewhere else? I'm fascinated by this, but I can't answer that question until I know how it actually.
Go ahead and I'll correct you if I think you're wrong.
You think I'm wrong?
No, I said go ahead and I'll correct you and second guess you if I think.
So, for example, stormwater program. Maybe there's, right now we would say, well, let's raise the rates for everyone for their impervious surfaces, and then we'll create like you're doing, create a prioritization and go and do it. Maybe a big company like a Veolia, I don't work for them, so I'm not selling them. Maybe they could come in and say, look, we've got $500 million and we can build it now, but you just give us the 40 years to pay it back, and then we'll work it out this way. So they can bring in capital and finance it in different kinds of ways. You end up paying them, but you might have paid that money anyway, and then the question is that an advantage or not? And it's not just stormwater, they do wastewater or water supply or even water filtration, or, there's lots of different subsets of what we typically in the Northwest sell on the public side. We provide publicly that could be provided privately. And one of the advantages of the private is that it brings in funds. So, for example, the bridge, the Tacoma-Pierce Bridge, that was financed with private capital. That was the way the state was able to get that bridge in.
I was just going to say that there were four projects originally that were going to be public-private partnerships, and that's the only one that was ever built. The others are all died.
Right, and that's usually because the private guys want more money than we're willing to provide.
Yeah.
It was the approval process.
Oh, the approval.
So if you want to get an animated discussion in any audience around the United States, bring up the topic of climate change or bring up the topic of privatization. And those words will define people's perceptions and how they discuss how to deal with some water issues. And on the climate change, if you don't get wrapped around the axle of the politics and the big science questions and the role of mankind, you can focus in on some issues about water scarcity, extreme weather, resiliency of infrastructure, smart decisions that any good businessman would make to ensure against risk. On the privatization front, this country, from what I've seen over the last 20 to 30 years, has really had some rough and tumble debates, more so than other countries around the world, over the role of the private sector in owning, operating, managing our water and wastewater utilities and systems. And increasingly, I would say that the discussion, I'm encouraged in one sense, even though I'm looking at a glass half empty in terms of the ticking time bomb of aging infrastructure that was built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s throughout the country, and the dislike of the public right now to pay a whole lot for upgrading those hidden crises that are beginning to surface. The good news is that I think more and more there's a reality, there's leadership in government and in business sector and in public citizen groups to say, you know, we really do need to think about how do we get an infusion of money and private sector business expertise, but still have fundamental accountability and public ownership of the water and wastewater systems. And to some extent now the stormwater systems. You know, there are 2,000 or more stormwater utilities that have been developing around the country, partly to try to get expertise on the stormwater issue and also to raise money through stormwater taxes or fees. But on the privatization issue, it's really, if you define it more as, well, privatization is the extreme end of the spectrum where the sale of assets go to a private for-profit entity. Way before you get to that level, extreme, and most communities and the public feel that's too far. But there are an array of different approaches that involve some version of a private sector entity with private capital and investment manages, operates, maintains some aspect of the system without having the public trust or the keys handed over to that private for-profit entity. And that model, I mean, it's happening in different cities. And just like the first generation of low-flow toilets, there have been colossal problems and a public backlash in some cities on privatization. And now, you know, I was here in Seattle in this area in 2006 touting the new water-efficient toilets, the ones that really do work and save money and get a certain certification. Well, when it comes to the scale of privatization, public-private partnerships, there are mayors, there are unions of employees who are beginning to build trust with some type of public entity, private entity that comes in and manages the infrastructure in a more sustainable way, you know. But that to me, that is a huge topic of national importance to the United States, and it plays out in cities all around right now.
And there was a local proposal up in Seattle, 32 acres, where they would treat the wastewater on site, reuse the treated wastewater to flush the toilets. It would reduce their water use by half and their wastewater generation by 70% reduction. And it would be, and Seattle Public Utilities said, we don't want to run that thing. If there's a private entity that wants to take that on and run it, then they can do that. And we'll expect them to be credible. We'll double check that they know what they're doing. But they were fine with that idea that a smaller subset of their bigger system could be privatized. There's another project looking at a sewer heat recovery project where a small district energy system would go in, Seattle City Light again, wouldn't own it or operate it, but it would be nested inside the public. So there's other, like Ben said, there's lots of different arrays. But I'm not trying to force it as a topic. I'm just saying it's one of those topics.
It's a big one. It's a really important big one and a controversial one.
Another thing that came up quite often today was the whole certification and that. And there's great work going on here. And maybe that also could be something that could be a topic. It certainly seemed to be Tacoma's being leader in that sort of thinking. Were there any other topics that folks out there had thought might be of interest next year?
And let me modify your request slightly, Steve. It's not just about next year's Wellspring conference. It's about what we do between now and then. And so this marketing piece, very interesting. The harmonization piece, very interesting. How can we, as a group, get engaged in those things to help them work out to our advantage? So think about it in that vein too. It's not just about what our agenda is for next year's conference. It's about what we're doing between now and then. Okay. All right, here we go. We got a hand up. I know everyone heard the ice and the glass clinking. Very impressed with your discipline. No one fled to the back. That is a reception that will be starting shortly that you're all, of course, going to be invited to and are part of.
Chris.
So just in terms of, and I work at the Economic Development Board, so in terms of looking at how we take these great assets that we've gotten, all these really brilliant minds that are here today, and turn these into jobs at some point, I wanted to take off on a couple comments I said earlier, and I think that one of the opportunities we should be really thinking about is making this a great place for entrepreneurs and innovators to come to create technologies that we can license in other countries. I think that's where the opportunity is. I think licensing in China and Southeast Asia and some of the markets where we talk about is probably one way we could think about exporting and making this a job creator at the end of the day. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that, if licensing and trying to make the technology here license other places makes sense, and how do we build toward that?
I think that's a great comment. Maybe what we'll do is we'll just wrap this up, and maybe we could ask Ben and Art if you have any last thoughts, and then we'll turn it back to Bruce.
There are two comments that I have that'll take about 30 seconds. One is there's a quote, I think it's from Kennedy Jinks, which is a consulting firm in this area, but their quote is, "Hope is not a BMP." And I like that because it implies that it's good to have honorable intentions and to hope for improvement, but you really need discipline and technology and commitment to make a real difference, particularly on challenging topics. And the other one is from a good friend who is the former Secretary of Food and Agriculture for the state of California, who was quoting someone who said that you can't trust your judgment if your imagination is out of focus. And I think when you have clusters or you have a broad and diverse and talented group that comes in and confronts a real and challenge and with different perspectives, multidisciplinary, that's where imaginations really can begin to run, and you can lead to smarter, more sustainable decisions, and that includes more jobs and a cleaner environment.
A number of years ago, when I was first hired in association management, the president who had hired me told me, and this was back in the late 80s, said, "Art, for the next 10 years or so, anything having to do with water is going to be a big issue." Well, here we are 25 years later, and water and related issues are still big issues. One of the things I took away from today is learning a little bit more about a lot of the efforts that are going on, whether it be in the private sector, finding additional techniques or treatments, some of the science, some of the regulatory, some of the other perspectives. But we have both a lot of opportunities to move forward and make a lot of these things work in the real world. And if, to the extent we do so, we'll resolve some of the issues of the pollution, the Puget Sound, and in our waterways. But there's also huge challenges that face us as well, and part of that's finding the science, finding out what works and what doesn't work, and streamlining the process of making that available to be used by people.
Great comments, great comments from the audience. So let's thank everyone for this session. Thanks.